So I'm Carrie. I'm the UK and Europe steel editor at Kallanish. If you don't know Kallanish, we publish daily global steel news and pricing and a bit of research as well. And I'm going to give you an overview of kind of pretty much all the steel markets. So here we've just had our conference in Amsterdam covering the steel market. So I'll probably sum that up for you all because pretty much everything you've already said are in these slides. So we're all quite well aligned with what's happening in the market and there's no big shocks. A global pricing overview of kind of the published indices that are already out there. I'll dig into the UK and EU briefly, and then I'll focus on some of the recent UK headlines I'm sure most of you already know. So this is focusing on EU demand rather than UK demand, but people had hoped things would improve this year, but unfortunately Trump opened his big mouth and it's all kind of gone slightly awry now, so that demand is definitely delayed, and most people there, so the conference was attended by steelmakers, traders from all of the kind of steel consuming sectors. They were the ones who felt like the recovery wouldn't happen until the end of Q4, maybe into Q1 of next year, but it was actually very regional and very sector based. So there's a disparity, and it's quite hard to say European demand growth in the same way as UK demand growth of, in Poland, the longs market was going to be very different to the machinery sector in Germany. So there are disparities. There are some areas of growth and other areas where it's just really not good. So that's something to kind of keep in mind when you're looking at kind of top line numbers. You need to really dig into where the demand is. Customers currently really reluctant to buy anything. As we know, demand is currently not great and it hasn't been. So they don't want to buy the tons, but they need to, because if they're coming from overseas, they're going to arrive in Q1 and they're going to be facing CBAM charges. So they're kind of stuck, and the traders are trying to get people to sort of get on board with ordering it, but we're going into the summer. So there's, will their material arrive in time? Will it face fees? We don't know. Energy cost disparities continue. Obviously, the UK has really high energy rates. Same as in Europe. Spain versus Italy, Germany versus other locations. France, for example, France has got a lot of nuclear, Germany's has a lot of coal. So there are, again, disparities in manufacturing costs, and that always plays into price and demand as well. Trade tariffs and geopolitical tensions, it's impossible for anyone to forecast at the moment. I'm glad that I'm not an analyst, I'm a journalist, so that's fine by me. I'm not forecasting what's going to happen next week, 6 months, a year ago. I think every time these analysts do this work and then Trump decides to change his mind again, they have to throw it away and start again. So it's really hard. There's so much uncertainty. I know we've spoken about as well. The uncertainty makes it really hard to have any kind of confidence in what to buy or what the market will look like. And unfortunately, it doesn't really seem like these uncertainties will be reduced anytime soon, especially there's various wars going on, various trade wars going on. There's just a lot of uncertainty kind of globally, and that's going to continue, unfortunately, which just means more uncertainty, which will weigh on demand. CBAM, we've already discussed, it's going to cause massive disruption. And someone said about the market not being ready at the conference on the panels. They were saying they estimate less than half of the market is ready. And that includes traders, importers. They just don't know what's coming. Part of that, as some people said, they're just pretending it's not happening. They haven't really focused on it or learnt about it. And other people just think it won't happen. But it's only 6 months away. But there are definitely areas where there isn't clarity, things like melt and pour or different kind of derivatives, stuff on scrap, etc. And it was only recently they confirmed proposals to change it. So they changed certain tonnage limits, they changed certain, when you buy the certificates has changed as well. So that kind of goes on to here's frustration at lack of known value. So your obligation starts in 2026, but when you purchase the certificates is further down the line. So if you're a trader importing material for someone, you don't actually know how much you'll be charging them. When the material arrives Q1 2026, you don't know how much you're going to have to charge your customer because you don't have to purchase certificates on Q1 2026 because they've delayed. When you purchase the certificates, the obligation to pay remains starting from 2026. So that creates massive uncertainty. Like if you're a trader, how could you possibly estimate what that's going to cost? Although they do estimate prices will rise 50 to 60 euros. That's a combination, obviously, carbon taxes to pay versus availability of material, because as CBAM comes in, a lot of material won't come. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit as well, about what material will just not be available. And that does create opportunity for European producers to step in if they have the supply. But ultimately, buyers need to purchase soon, but there's still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of things to be ironed out. So that also doesn't help anyone. We touched on green steel. UK, EU steelmakers, they are still expecting green steel demand to emerge, it's quite delayed. So the green hydrogen is really delayed. They might have to start with grey or blue hydrogen or even gas to start these projects with, especially some of the German steelmakers who might be using DRI. They want to use green hydrogen one day, but it currently either does not exist in terms of supply or the price is too high to be feasible. So they're going to start gas probably and then transition. But they do see challenges there. They see the automotive sector being one of the dominant green steel demand sector. And that's mainly because of electric vehicles. So for a normal ICE car, manufacturing emissions might only be this amount of their whole emissions. But when you remove the tailpipe emissions, manufacturing emissions become a much bigger part. So those embodied emissions from steel manufacturing, that means they've got to get them down. And there are a lot of automotive manufacturers currently working with steelmakers. They want to trial the green steel, they want to use it, and they will pay a premium for it because they need to. So certain sectors, there is demand, a bit of construction demand, because actually if you use green steel in your building, the total cost of using that isn't that high, the same as putting green steel in a car, because there's other inputs. It isn't a huge amount. It doesn't add on a huge amount, especially for like a luxury car maker. Okay, it's a few £100s more, but if you're buying a luxury car anyway, is that really going to make a difference? No. So yeah, some areas where there will be green steel demand, and I know we touched on, it's not on here, touched on the lack of definitions, the lack of standards. There are emerging standards. Germany have a published standard. India was the first government in the world to have an accepted green steel standard. It's really high. It's not what kind of the West might call green steel if you're using an EAF and scrap, which would be really low emissions. But for India, that's where it is. So it's kind of emerging, and it's kind of hope they'll kind of come together and have, it's really hard to pronounce, interoperability between the standards. So the IEA has a standard, GSCC have a standard, Responsible Steel have a standard, but they're trying, and World Steel are working to try and have some common ground with the standards so that people can, A, not be afraid of greenwashing, but also everyone knows what they're talking about. But it takes time, and it's one of those pieces that it's a piece of it. It's not the main conversation. So that's one of those. Growth in renewables. So renewable capacity is expanding, and it is becoming a lot cheaper to use renewables, which is good if you're trying to get your emissions down. We touched on this as well briefly. Scrap export restrictions. There is quite a debate going on at the moment. Some of the recycling groups, they think there should be European scrap export bans. And on the other side, some recycling groups are adamantly against this. They believe in free trade, open market, and that's really going to continue and intensify as demand rises for scrap, which it will, because the UK and Europe are all switching to EAFs from blast furnaces. So, and because of that, scrap prices are set to rise long term. Those are the forecasts. If you want it, you've got to pay for it. There's not enough. And that also means more investment is needed in scrap collection and processing. So we know the steelmakers, they want the scrap for the EAFs, but they want to produce the same steel they were producing as blast furnaces, especially the flats. They need high quality steel, which means they have to pay for it. There needs to be more processing to make it really high quality. And if you think about all the scrap that we export out of the UK, it's not all high quality. Some of it is crap. So that's going to mean they have to pay more, and it will be more in demand. Added this and that at the bottom from the conference. Some of the longs producers, they already use scrap and renewable energy, so good for them, their emissions are low, but it means they get nothing from the EU in terms of funds, because all the funds go to the blast furnace people with much higher emissions. But they also feel like the safeguard protections in the EU have all focused on flats so far, and there's very little protection for like longs such as rebar. So there's kind of a disparity and unhappiness between longs and flats at the moment. But there are displacement opportunities ahead. So as I said, CBAM, if you are producing longs overseas with blast furnace, your emissions are going to be too high probably to send it to Europe, which means if you're a European EAF producer, you have opportunity to supply domestically because those imports just won't happen because they would just be too expensive. Chinese export likely to continue rising. Last year, they actually reached a record high. I think it was about 120 million tonnes. 110? 120 this year. And the domestic market in China is incredibly weak. The construction sector has continued to have challenges, and the supportive policy from the government is just not there. So that's why the exports are so high. But there's also growing Chinese investment in Southeast Asia as well to maintain their market presence. And it's been mulled potential for domestic production cuts in China, which would weigh on the iron ore markets. This hasn't been agreed, but it could be about 100 million tonnes. To focus slightly on India, India have also said we don't want to export to the EU anymore because our emissions are too high. So, and they want to focus inward. India has massive growth opportunities, massive infrastructure investment. They also have really high capacity goals as well. So for them, and they also have a policy of wanting to reduce imports as well. They want to reduce their imports of scrap and coking coal and whatever. They want to be more self-reliant and feed that domestic market as well. So we do see there were some Indian steelmakers there, and this is exactly what they want to do. They want to grow their capacity domestically, sell domestically, and sure, there might be some volumes of greener material come to the EU, maybe from a joint venture somewhere else. And this is actually reflected in some slides later on. India just have really gone off the EU market. It's not there, but it just means that those tons are being replaced somewhere else. So just touch on rising protectionism. Kind of globally, there's been the EU safeguarding review, UK trade deals with US and India, and there's anti-dumping and safeguarding pretty much everywhere across all the countries to kind of tackle the flow of Chinese steel, which is just everywhere at the moment. This is a story I wrote about. We might have a trade deal with the US, and we've agreed we're going to cut those tariffs to zero, but it hasn't happened yet. People are still paying it. They're still waiting for the clarity. And even though it was originally announced back in May, and Trump then increased the tariff to everyone to 50%, apart from the UK gets 25%, it hasn't been reduced to zero. So it might be a good headline that we've got the trade deal and it's zero. But at the moment, people are still paying it. Could go into the detail on that, but it's likely those UK exports to the US are actually just continuing and they're paying the tariff anyway, because that material tends to be really specialised and they don't produce it currently domestically in the US. So that's where we are. I'm going to touch on this briefly. So this is the tariff rate quotas at the moment that I got updated earlier this week, I think, or end of June. It just kind of shows that we're not really using them. They're half used, flats, HRC, as you can see, they're just not a huge flood of material coming and they're just not really being utilised. And to compare to the EU, here we are in the EU, kind of similar, a decent amount remaining to the flats in general, which is slightly more. But I highlighted this one here, the red circle, that's India. They've got 93% remaining. They have stopped their imports to the EU. It used to be a really prominent supplier in the EU, but India aren't doing that anymore, and it's so evident. But also just to highlight this is EU. HRC is here, but if you look at kind of the more specialised grades, they are actually importing the metal coated, the cold rolled, the coated. So that's kind of where the demand is. I don't know, and I'm going to move on to UK market in a minute. But bog standard HRC is not being utilised at the moment. A bit more demand for the specialised stuff. And this is just prices for our published price indices. This is the first 6 months of the year in Turkey scrap. I do actually need my notes for this. Haven't used any of my notes so far. Hold on. Oh yeah, okay, fine. So things were on the up. Things were going quite well. And then it all kind of went downhill. This very large slump here. Turkey and the scrap market have had a tough old time. Really poor fundamentals, poor finished steel demand in Turkey, tariff uncertainty, thinner margins, higher supply, interest rates hikes in Turkey, the depreciation of the lira, the US dollar has also been really volatile, and US scrap prices have also been under pressure. Small signs of recovery here, but ultimately those finished steel sales remaining poor, it's just going to limit it. But this is a 6 month view. But if you go to a whole year view, you can see it was kind of trending down pretty much H2 last year before it kind of started recovering. So that volatility is there, but it hasn't yet recovered to where it was before the fall. On iron ore, again, you kind of see the volatility here. Iron ore has really struggled with the US-China trade war, which has seen many different tariffs come out, different rules. It's been delayed, it's been hiked up again. That kind of thing is awful for uncertainty. It really doesn't help. So it's been below $100 for a good couple of weeks now, and there's really no sign of it going back $100 rest of this year. It's just not there. The demand isn't there. The Chinese market is poor. There's rising Australian supply, which is just continuing to weigh on it. Hold on. Oh, okay. This is HRC flats, just from a global perspective. And the red line is Northern Europe ex-works, and the green line is FOB India. And it's quite interesting to see the similarity here of India and Northern Europe. This is obviously FOB as export to Europe, and this is the domestic price in Europe. They have followed a really similar trend. It just highlights that material and the markets are following a similar trend and they're seeing the same levels of weakness. China at the bottom, no major hikes, but still quite poor, and then GCSE is the orange. To put that on a European perspective, again, we see that real correlation of India in the orange, Italy in the green, and Northern Europe in the red. The blue is UK HRC, which was a price that I launched earlier this year, so it's not got as much, but it hasn't followed the same trend as similarly as the other ones have. And I'm going to touch on that in a minute, but it kind of goes to show that the UK market is not a mini Europe. They do tend to operate separately. They are influenced. They're not going to follow the exact same trends as Europe. So here's flats in UK HRC. As I said, launched earlier this year. We did a consultation with the market, got some feedback on the specs. It's pretty bog standard stuff, nothing special. And prices is the midpoint as well. Prices were really steady. If the market was flat, it was ticking along, it was fine, but there were no real kind of like huge demand drivers, nothing to push it up. There were some of the mills trying to push towards £600 kind of in May time and trying to push the price higher. They never got to £600, it didn't happen. And because it was so stagnant, people started to become a bit worried about, will it trend lower? And sentiment end of May, it did trend lower, sentiment broke, and there were a lot of arrivals of overseas materials. So that South Korea, Vietnam material arrived. There's a good amount of supply on the market, and it weighed on the prices just because that demand just isn't really there. There are gaps in mill order books for some of the summer months. So again, mills being more competitive on price this time to get those orders in. And I think most people had accepted there would be a correction in late summer, after the summer, after all the holidays when it's seasonally a bit lower. It seems to have happened before the summer to have that downward movement. I have no idea what's next one. Sorry, I didn't use my notes at all and I don't know where I am. Okay. So some recent headlines. We've already mentioned the TRA changes are here. They're coming into place very soon. Some other headlines, obviously, the British Steel situation. It's not resolved. The ownership hasn't yet been resolved. They still need a partnership for their transformation to EAF because those blast furnaces just won't live forever. That's still, I know at other kind of joint meetings, British Steel has been discussed a lot for terms of uncertainty. Perhaps that uncertainty is a bit more reduced now and not as concerning, but it's in the background. And the potential as well to link the UK and EU markets is a good thing. It will make it easier. Our main trading partner for steel is Europe, so that would be a good thing as CBAM comes in. Also add to the safeguarding, the UK is also investigating South Korean plate imports as well. So there is still continuing safeguarding and anti-dumping investigations. So we spoke a bit about demand and all the different things that have been going on. So there's been the infrastructure strategy, the strategic defence review, the industrial strategy's just come out, and there's also a spending review. These all sound like really good things. They are meant to be supportive of steel consumption, and it does show that this current government, they want to do more for the steel industry than the past government have. Obviously, there's also the steel strategy, which is supposed to be supportive. However, I've written this story, and if you'd like to read it, just come and ask me to have it. It basically focuses on the UK government say they want to do really good things. They want to recycle submarines and build new submarines with the steel, and they want loads of steel plate for offshore wind demand. But if you speak to anyone in the industry, how much plate capacity do we have in the UK at the moment? Not a huge amount of plate capacity, really, if anything. So the UK has really good ideas, but in terms of it actually happening, we need investment in, someone needs to take Liberty's plate mill and get it back online because it's been offline for about a year. And currently we meet half our consumption with imports. So for example, Heathrow, they want 40,000 tonnes of steel for their expansion if it goes ahead. Is there even enough steel in the UK to support them with that, or is it going to be met by imports? So there will be some of this demand will be met by imports, even though the MOD want to change their procurement scheme. There's still going to be some imports. We just either don't have as much steel as we need, or we just don't produce it. So there is a harsh reality of what the government are planning versus what's actually feasible at the moment. And whilst they can say, we've got 500 million for steel or whatever, even construction or infrastructure demand, it takes time for that money to filter through. They have to identify where they want it, and then what they want, and then who they want to do it. And you're several years down the line before anyone sees any of this money at all. In the meantime, the steel industry still has to survive in that time and be around to utilise those funds. So again, a gap between ambition and reality. And just to finish off, one of my directors, Paul Mullins, did this presentation last year for Nass, and he kindly gave me his slides. And this is what he ended on last year, 2024 market highlights. And I thought it was really interesting for when I was putting this presentation together to see how many of these events and themes are actually still present or have just concluded. So it's in blue, not red, because I can't read it. But so British Steel deal, not yet agreed. Obviously, it's half agreed now, a year later. You might know ADI's ILVA. That's been going on for my entire career, still not resolved. Kallanish just come online a year later, just restarted. This blue one, again, was actually a different CCU project about using feed gases, but their other CCU project they've just given up the ghost pretty much this week because the EU rules on bioethanol haven't applied to what they've been producing. It's not worth the money, so that's closing. US Steel Nippon merger, pretty much just gone ahead. It's taken a whole year, only just gone ahead. And at the time, it said China steel exports at 9-year high. They were a record high in the end for 2024 and expected to be really high.